I'm a boomer, kill me. So far this month, I've only reached Master 1 one time, and that was with a Shining Sarcophagus deck somehow. I don't know how that happened. And I actually enjoyed the process of climbing with it, so I figured I might just yap about it a little bit on a recording. I'm gonna go over the cards real quick, then show a couple lists that I didn't even try, so I'm totally qualified to talk about them, and then I'm gonna show my list and maybe talk about a little bit how my games usually went with potentially a replay recording if I have one saved still. I don't think there's really much of a point in going over quote-unquote combos, because that's one of the main things about this deck, is that it is fairly straightforward and doesn't really have combos at the moment at least. But I guess we'll get to that when we get there. So let's get into it. Shining Sarc is obviously the core card of the deck. If you don't have this, you can put all of your other cards in the trash. They basically don't have effects, or sometimes they literally don't have effects if you don't have this card. And it allows you to search for anything else, and it's also indestructible by monster effects, which kind of matters. You have gadgets. They search for any Shining Sarc spell trap, which includes Shining Sarc, and they float into a garbage trap card that you shouldn't be running. We have Silent Magician 0. This is a spell negate. We have Silent Swordsman 0. This is a targeted effect activation negate for Sarc cards. And we have a nuke that summons from the deck afterwards as well, and it can be brought out for free if you have Sarc. Most of the other monsters range from mid to bad at the moment, but let's go over them real quick as well. Mustard Summoned Skull can be summoned without a tribute if you have Sarc, and also he's a change of heart when you summon him. This guy is Dark Magician, and if he's destroyed while you have a level 5 or higher, so probably a Gandora, he comes back and then he can search for a spell trap. There is kind of a little bit of a note to this guy. Whispers from a Dark Mage in Mordor are claiming that potentially we might be getting Dragoon back. If we get Dragoon, this card actually becomes kind of relevant, and you might want to play even multiple copies, and it might change how the deck is ran, because it allows you to set up Dragoon relatively easily, but at the moment I don't think it's even worth running. It's kind of a brick, and the search targets are pretty bad. And last and most certainly least is More Marshmallow. This guy is a attack redirector and can't be destroyed by battle. Technically he's not useless, and he could like matter in some matchups, but I feel like I'd rather have a tech card, and if your opponent knows how to read, then he's not very dangerous at all. The spells are a bit of a mixed bag. They're not completely awful. This one allows you to summon 2 level 4 or lower monsters, so most of the time that's gonna be your silence. That being said, okay, if there is a combo, right? If you have your Sarc and you have your Tie-Dye Binds or Silent Magician, I do prefer starting off with Silent Magician on the board into Ties That Bind into summoning the gadget from the deck alongside the Silent Swordsman 0, because people usually don't read your cards and they don't know what they do, though it might have changed now that it's a loner in the festival. And they will often try to imperm or veiler your gadget on its search, which you can then promptly negate with the Silent Swordsman 0 that you bring out. That actually was the main case of me being able to activate Silent Swordsman, was if I summoned him alongside Gadgetree and they had Imperm or Veiler. Turn Silence is a pretty good card, but it's also one of those cards that significantly becomes way worse if you don't have Sarc on the field already. This is a monster effect negate that doesn't have to target, and it can also end the battle phase. That being said, the timing when it ends the battle phase is a little bit awkward in regards to the Tempai matchup. They already get to perform their special summons from the deck, but oftentimes they do get caught off guard, so it's still fairly potent. Future Silence just lets you grab any monster from the deck, which of course is great because your gadgets are able to grab the Sarc for you, so this card is amazing as well. And then at the very end we have a bunch of trap cards. These are awful in my opinion. This one allows you to destroy your opponent's stuff if they're trying to destroy you, and also gives you 1 protection per card every turn. I don't think that's very good. And the last one is a trap monster, and it can sometimes pop if your opponent attacks. This is way too slow. This is an example of a Kashtira build with couple bestials included as well. Awkwardly enough though, there's 2 cards that are now not going to be available, which promptly brings it down to exactly 40 cards. I do think there's a couple anti-synergistic aspects of this deck. Some of the hand traps can't be used under D-Shifter or your Ice Heart, which is obviously the big boss monster of this deck. You get a little bit of a benefit from the fact that Dark Magician is level 7 and you can summon it out. But overall, I'm not super impressed with this build conceptually. Of course, I didn't really try it, but just the fact that this seems to, for the most part, be a nerfed version of Kashtira, which isn't already that strong of a deck, just didn't seem all that appealing to me personally, at least. Here's an example of a more pure-ish build. This probably is more focused on the Shining Sarc stuff than even my build, even though in terms of monster ratios, it's not that different. Just utilizing Super Poly, which currently is pretty good, and a bunch of hand traps and hoping that that's enough to keep your opponent at bay. You know, you have your gadget trio into Shining Sarc, and then you either search for bonds to summon your 2 silence or to go for turn silence to have the monster negate and the attack stop. It's not horrible by any means, but it might feel lacking, especially if your opponent isn't playing something that is affected by super polymerization. But I think for people who are interested in just the archetype on its own, this might be something worth looking at as well. I was considering including a version of the TCG Darlings engine, which is Dogmatica, which is a fairly common pairing as well alongside with this deck, but I ended up not really finding a list that looked too interesting. But I will mention it here. You know, you can play your Dogmatica with the Ecclesia, with the Fleur-de-Lis potentially, with the Punishment and Nadir's Servant, allowing you to dump from the extra deck, stuff like Entis, stuff like Garura to get even more advantage. It potentially can be not horrible, but again, I don't think this really brings that much to the table compared to some of the stronger generic cards that you can play instead, but it's certainly an option. Some people even combine it with the ritual part of the deck, making some sort of a weird amalgamation. I don't know, I mean, if it works for you, it works for you. I actually planned to record this a week ago, which I suppose would have made it slightly less relevant. Dimensional Shifter and Dimensional Fissure are both cards that have a little bit of relevance in the deck because of Gandora gaining attack from banished cards, but also this deck doesn't really care as much about its graveyard. Outside of turn silence, there's not much you care about in there, which is why it's fairly common to play said card, especially if they're good in the meta, which they're okay at the moment. Even Tempai does hurt from it. That being said, Dimensional Shifter is being put to 1, and as a result probably isn't really worth running anymore because you're super likely to end up with at least 1 card in the graveyard immediately, and as a result, if you don't draw a Shifter turn 1, it's probably going to be dead. Destined Rivals is here because that's probably the best search target you have right now for the Dark Magician guy if you want to run him. Since he becomes Dark Magician on the field, you can just negate the effects of all face-up monsters your opponent currently controls. This card's not awful, but the potential of drawing into this as a brick or just drawing Dark Magician itself going first if you don't have Sarc or, you know, Gandora access with Sarc is just so bad that I wouldn't dare risking it personally. And then, of course, alongside the Dimensional Fissure, there's other floodgates that you can play, which actually I guess should change it so you can see that they're limited. But yeah, Summon Limit and Tikaboo are both entirely viable in this deck, and of course they are fairly powerful. Small engine that some people consider is the Draglubion for Numeron Dragon. I feel like while it's true that this deck doesn't necessarily have a super easy time assembling an OTK on turn 3 unless your opponent has a bunch of cards that do get destroyed by Gandora, allowing you to summon a high-level Sun, Magician, or Swordsman, going for an instant OTK. I feel like it's not really worth the extra deck slots in a lot of the builds, especially if you play Super Poly. And it's just such a easy to interrupt cheese method that I personally am not fond of it, but it is something that can be considered, especially if playing multiple Gandoras, or if you destroy a small amount of cards that allow you to summon the monster from the deck with Gandora's effect to be a level 8. And of course, at the very end, honorary mention for Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. If it does actually get unbanned, this card probably is going to be core in a lot of people's builds. In the TCG, it seems to be fairly relevant for playing this deck. Untargetable, indestructible Beb card effect, and also having that once per turn Omni Negate, this card is pretty decent. And here's the big reveal. This is the build that I ended up playing. Again, Prosperity probably can easily be taken out. After I finished my climb, I realized I wasn't running crossed out designator, which probably would make a lot of sense. One of the biggest problems whenever you play this deck is obviously not having access to your Shining Sarcophagus, and the best way to get to it is through Gadget Trio. Guess which card resolved less than 50% of the time while I was playing due to being negated by mostly infinite impermanence? Yup, that's right, it was Max C. No, of course it was Gadget Trio. There are a couple other things. I guess in the text I should have potentially considered Sarcophagus as well. A couple people did mention it. I do feel like it's a little bit too niche, but if you're crazy, you could try it out. It might not be awful. That being said, I think it definitely falls off a lot heavier afterwards, because after you do get your deck rolling, your Silent Swordsman basically serves the same purpose already. So before addressing anything else, I'm also gonna go over the ratios a little bit. Obviously, you want to be on triple Gadget Trio because that's your starter. I am a big proponent of running 2 Silent Magician 0 because usually on your turn 1 setup, and this is obviously a turn 1 build, after your turn 1 setup, you're gonna have Silent Magician 0. Oftentimes, your follow-up pushes, especially if your opponent has a board, will include attempting to resolve the Gandora G board wipe effect, which means you would lose your Silent Magician 0, and then it's fairly nice to have access to another Silent Magician 0 afterwards, immediately being summoned off of Gandora or brought out by other means. But I do think it comes up quite a lot. Solid Swordsman isn't really that amazing of a card. One of the only upsides he has is that he gains attack on both players' turns, so he can ramp up relatively quickly. In only 3 turns, he becomes a 2500 attack beatstick. That being said, one of the main reasons why I would say he needs to be included is because you kind of don't have a lot of names, and your grind game gets really bad after you resolve Gandora, especially if you destroy any of your own monsters to resolve it, which is also partially the reason why I opted to keep Archfiend's Advent. This card is not great going first, obviously. It's pretty nice for trying to break boards, but it's also obviously not the strongest. It's really good into unsuspecting Tenpai players, though, I found, because the change of heart effect, there's a couple ways how you can utilize it. Obviously, if you just OTK your opponent, it doesn't matter. Oftentimes, I would link off problem monsters into SP Lone Knight. Another thing that I also, I guess, immediately can add, I guess maybe running a couple more easy link monsters, maybe multiple copies of SP Lone Knight or something else might have been worth it, but against some decks, you can occasionally steal tuners, and there is a relevant level 4 tuner in the game right now in the Tenpai deck in Chandra, which means you can actually just make Barone, which is really good because you just joink their monster and you make a negate for free. But yeah, if you wanted to cut down on some of the cards, I think obviously Archfiend's Advent could be cut. I imagine that Gandora G could also go down to 1, but it is definitely a problem after your turn 4 and 5 and onwards that you might feel like you're running out of monsters, especially if you're not playing any engine like Kashtira, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. I opted to play 3 Super Poly. I think this card is really strong right now in general. It's mainly the fact that your opponent can't respond to it, but also being able to remove 2 of their monsters against something like Tenpai is pretty good and has saved me a lot of times. And then similar reasoning is also applied to the Solemns. They are obviously strong cards overall, being able to negate monster summons or effects and then just card activations or monster summons for Solemn Strike and Judgment respectively. But their main strength comes from the fact that your opponent just straight up can't respond to them with anything that isn't a counter trap. There were maybe 2 red reboots that occurred against me, but other than that, most of the time your opponent is just kind of caught with their pants down, especially if they try to like Black Rose Dragon you or something. You just negate the summon and they are just sitting there thinking, why wasn't their monster unaffected? Well, that's because it wasn't on the field. For Super Poly targets, I opted to run quite a lot of things. I don't think I ever summoned Yubel, maybe 1 time. And I also similarly only got to summon Earth Golem at Igniser 1 time. So if you wanted to have more space for something else, I guess you could cut those. That being said, I also never summoned Ingir, so I added it because it's royal, but it didn't really come up. Chaos Angel comes up a decent amount of time, however, because you have not only Archfiend's Advent plus the Silent Magician 0 or the Silent Swordsman 0, but you also have the occasional scenarios where you summon something from the deck, increase its level, and then it becomes level 7, either through its own effect or through just Gandora's effect, and you can just use Ash Blossom Blossom as a tuner as well. And decent amount of people are actually surprisingly not great at dealing with Chaos Angel. I mean, some builds just kind of struggle with it. The rest is fairly self-explanatory, I think. There's Handtraps, obviously 3 of the Searcher. I think 2 of the Turn Silence Negate is enough. A lot of my games, it did matter that I had a second one, especially after turn 1 setup. If I had to use it, having another one is great. But 3 would most likely be seen a bit too often, especially at duplicates, and the card is just completely dead. Well, maybe not entirely dead. You can use the graveyard effect still, and you can gain attack technically on these 2 if you increase their levels, but this card is dead if you don't have Shining Sarc, so not increasing the number of cards that are bad without your main card is probably a good idea. The lone Cosmic Cyclone was kind of a I don't know what to put my 40th card as, and honestly I didn't really dislike seeing it in any hand. It came up in pretty much every matchup that I drew it in. There were some games that I won because specifically I had Cosmic Cyclone. That being said, there is one concern that came up a couple of times, and that is you pay a lot of life points in this deck. Between the Solemn Judgments, the Solemn Strikes, and even the Gandora G, sometimes you can't afford to use Cosmic Cyclone, and then similarly, sometimes you can't afford to use Solemn Strike, right? Like if you have both of these, you prefer to start with Strike and then use Judgment because you pay ultimately slightly less life points as a result by doing that. But sometimes you don't get to choose, and there was a case, for example, where I was really hoping for my opponent to activate a monster effect or try to special summon a monster without starting a chain first when I had Cosmic Cyclone and Strike, because if I had the Cosmic first, I would be down to 1500 life points exactly, and my Strike would be dead. But yeah, there were quite a lot of games where I'm like, okay, well, at this point I have 3 dead cards in my deck in the Solemn Strikes, which admittedly you do have, you know, cards to discard for, but it doesn't feel amazing. Luckily, I did have 1 replay saved for this deck as well, and I think it's probably gonna be somewhat illustrative of how games end up going. So sometimes you just don't really open all that great. I already mentioned if you don't have Shining Sarc, this deck doesn't really do much. Well, this is like not a great hand in general. I ended up having to Solemn Judgment their Sunken Summoning because this card would apply pressure every single turn, and I can't afford to risk that. I just have to hope that they don't have enough, which luckily they didn't. They went straight into the Fadra, and they had a bunch of sets, so this guy probably opened similar to me, and then I just kept drawing not great cards, and it was a little bit painful for a short while. That being said, of course, opponent's also bricking here. This isn't really an illustration of, wow, this deck is so good, or this is how to perfectly play it or whatever, but it's more so a realistic depiction of how your games tend to go. Like, you don't do anything until you get to Shining Sarc, and then once you get to Shining Sarc, you actually need to start resolving Shining Sarc and or other cards alongside it, which makes it not too amazing. I don't know why I did this here, by the way. I decided to Solemn Judgment the Tribute Summon. I feel like it's kind of risky in a lot of ways. Obviously, you could say he clears this and then he's threatening lethal, but I'm also going for a search, so I don't know. I definitely could have survived a little bit longer. That being said, I did feel like he had some negates, and lo and behold, he had 2 copies of Droplet, burning an extra one, so my search doesn't go anywhere again. And then another slightly questionable choice, going for the SP Little Knight here and swinging with that. I think at that point I was a little bit concerned, hoping that maybe if he went for like a search or something, I could remove a card and then I would still have it in perm as well, etc. Luckily, the Ash Blossom comes through again, and at this point this guy's resources are pretty much all depleted, and I have my repeated threat of I can add a card every single turn for free. So, you know, it's pretty nice. Also, drawing into Turn Silence is nice at this point because it actually will do something once I have a Sarc monster and a Sarc on the board. He has them perm. I chose to dodge because, I don't know, I mean, it didn't really matter all that much, but I just wanted to have a little bit more on the field. And then I get to the gadgets. Gadgets grab the ties. Ties summon 2. This is like turn 1. And at this point, it's kind of impossible. But yeah, this is also another game where you just see straight up the Solemn Strike is completely dead at this point. So that's something worth considering. maybe not rushing crafting everything if you don't have it. It is an expensive build, and I think the Psalm Strikes are overall a little bit worse from my experience. When I looked at the base list that I was imitating at first, I figured that Psalm Strikes would be better because they pay less life points, which obviously is a silly thought because life points don't matter to begin with. But it's a worse card overall because it just gets unusable so often. But yeah, at this point, this guy can't do anything. I have a spell negate, a monster negate, and I can also end the battle phase, so he's just done so. Even with the droplet here, just doesn't have anything really left, and yeah, we win. Even if he could go and do something, right? Like, the best he could do would be summon Chandra and damage Shep summon. I would end the battle phase. He can either Synchro or Link Monster, and then, you know, that's that. That was my experience with Shining Sarc overall. I went in a heavy skeptic and I came out somehow a boomer believer. And while I wouldn't say that this is a good deck by any means, I mean, a lot of these cards are straight up awful. They read really bad. I think a lot of people are also underestimating it. That being said, I guess it has been a loner now, so some people might know it a bit better, which means that it loses a lot of its surprise power, and also I guess some people might be less skeptical now that they've seen it. But I will say, if you're not really feeling like playing a bunch of combo stuff and you just want to play the actual boomer Yu-Gi-Oh! By the way, like triple solemn, triple other solemn, this is like actual boomer gameplay right here. And no comboing, just activating trap, great. And not being forced to play floodgates, even better. But yeah, if that looks interesting, I would recommend it. I think it's pretty fun, and it's actually kind of capable as well. That's gonna be it. Maybe I'll make another video before the year is over. I don't know. Bye! And we have the big bad boy